She stood under the bright lights of the auditorium, her voice steady, her gaze clear. The crowd before her hushed as she spoke, every syllable measured, every word drawn from a place most people never dare revisit. In the front row, a man sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap. His eyes never left her. He knew this wasn't just a speech. This was her becoming. 7 years ago, she would have walked off stage and straight into his arms. Now, she didn't even glance his way. Sometimes the most painful endings teach us the deepest truths, not about others, but about ourselves. The room remained silent, but you could feel it. Every heart pulled closer to hers. There was no need to name names. Those who'd followed her journey knew, and even those who hadn't, they could see it in her poise, in the quiet grace she carried after walking through the fire. Have you ever trusted someone with every part of you, only to realize you were the only one trying to hold it together? Maybe you've been there. Maybe you're still trying to make sense of the hurt. Maybe you gave your best to someone who only loved the reflection you gave them, not the soul that held it. Let me tell you a story not just about heartbreak, but about strength, not about loss, but what a woman gained when the foundation of her life cracked beneath her. Before we begin, if you believe in the power of personal growth through life's hardest moments, make sure you tap the like button and subscribe. This channel brings you stories that remind us we are never truly alone in our pain or our healing. To those returning, thank you. You know why we're here. To those new, you're about to meet a woman who didn't just walk away. She rose. Her name is Alina Moreau. Long before the auditorium, before the applause, before the world saw her as a voice of quiet power, Alina was simply a woman in love, not with a fantasy, not with fairy tales, with a man who once looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd carried all his life. His name was Daxton Reeve. He had the world at his feet, fame, brilliance, influence, but to her, none of that mattered. What drew her in was the way he softened when no one was watching. How he would pause, mid-sentence to trace her knuckles, or stop meetings just to call her when her anxiety crept in. For a time, their world was quiet and private, honest. That's what made the silence later so unbearable, because silence after love, it's not peace, it's abandonment without closure. This story is not about revenge, it's about rediscovery. It's not about public scandals, it's about what happens in the quiet aftermath, the kind no one tweets about, the kind you live through at 2 a.m. when the apartment is empty and your heart is louder than the city outside. Alina lost almost everything, but what she found changed her life. She didn't fight to be noticed. She didn't scream to be heard. She chose a different kind of strength, the kind that builds slowly, the kind that lifts others as it lifts you. This is the kind of story that stays with you, not because of who hurt her, but because of how she healed. If you're watching this and you've ever had to rebuild, piece by piece, after someone broke what you thought was forever, leave a comment below. Tell us how you made it through, or just say, I'm still standing. That alone is powerful, because strength doesn't always need to shout. You see, betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting matches or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes quietly, through fading touches, missed calls, glances that no longer hold meaning. It creeps in as distance until the person sleeping beside you feels like a stranger with your memories. For Alina, the warning signs weren't neon. They were subtle. A missed dinner, a polite excuse, a gaze that drifted too long toward someone else. Still, she held on, not because she was naive, but because she believed in the version of love they'd built together. She fought to preserve the life they made. That kind of hope, that kind of commitment, is rare, but even the strongest bridges collapse when only one person is doing the holding. The heartbreak wasn't loud. It didn't make headlines, but it cracked something inside her that took time to understand, let alone repair. The world didn't come to her defense. In fact, it quietly walked away. Supporters vanished. Friends turned neutral. Her name faded from the spaces where she once stood tall beside him. But Alina didn't beg for her place back. She stepped away from the noise and chose herself. She built something new, not from spite, but from truth. She poured herself into the lives of others, into students who reminded her of who she used to be before the weight of someone else's betrayal dimmed her light. And years later, when fate put her back in the same room as the man who broke her, she didn't have to raise her voice. She just had to stand there, unbothered, unshaken, unbreakable. So let's begin. This is the true story of how Alina Moreau lost everything she thought mattered and found everything she truly needed. It began in a city known more for its cold winters than for kind twists of fate. Montreal was blanketed in snow that week. Flights had been canceled, taxis were scarce, and the hotel lobby was humming with stranded guests, all frustrated by delays. Among them, two people who weren't meant to meet until life made a quiet exception. Alina had just stepped off stage, her presentation on inclusive design, earning nods from an audience of tech executives and students alike. Her calm clarity and focus weren't born from performance, they were her natural state. For her, design wasn't about aesthetics, it was about empathy, about building systems where no one felt invisible. She didn't notice the man seated near the back, but he noticed her. Daxton Reeve had only been at the conference due to a rerouted flight. He was supposed to be in Chicago. Instead, he found himself listening, captivated, not by slides or charts, but by the woman, standing confidently on stage, her voice steady, her thoughts beautifully sharp. Afterward, he waited near the coffee table in the corridor, unsure of what to say. It wasn't charm he was used to relying on, it was his reputation, but she didn't seem the type to care about that. "I appreciated what you said about design being about dignity," he offered. Alina turned toward him. Her expression, though polite, was unreadable. "Most people design with power in mind," she replied, "not humanity." There was no flirtation in her tone, no effort to impress. That's what struck him the most. They ended up talking for nearly an hour. Not about money, not about headlines, about books, about small memories from childhood, about the people who shaped them. He told her he'd once wanted to be a writer before software pulled him in. She told him she used to sketch clothing as a child because patterns fascinated her. There was no performance between them, just the kind of honesty that happens when no one's trying too hard. Later that evening, they shared a quiet dinner at a small bistro tucked beside the cobblestone streets. Snowflakes gathered on the window as the candles burned low, and Daxton found himself speaking about his mother, a woman he rarely mentioned. Alina didn't press him, she just listened, the way people do when they aren't waiting to talk. By the end of the night, something had shifted. Neither said it out loud, but both felt it. This wasn't casual. The weeks that followed moved with a pace that didn't feel rushed. It felt certain. They exchanged messages that weren't just about plans, but about thoughts. They sent each other poems, voice notes, even snapshots of places they'd once called home. He flew to New York just to walk with her through the design museum she loved. She flew to San Francisco to watch him speak at a pitch event, waiting backstage, with tea and a note that said, "You're more than your numbers." In a world built on pace and pressure, their bond felt like pause, like space to breathe. She challenged him, not with harshness, but with quiet conviction. He wasn't used to someone who didn't need him to be impressive, and she wasn't used to someone who saw her depth before her beauty. On Sunday mornings, they'd cook together in silence. On weeknights, he'd read her Pablo Neruda, pausing when the words hit too close. When Alina had a migraine, Daxton would shut off all the lights and sit beside her in stillness, his hand gently on her back, saying nothing at all. Their love wasn't loud, it was steady. 10 months after Montreal, beneath the Tuscan sun, surrounded by just a handful of people who truly knew them, they exchanged vows at a small vineyard estate. No press, no spectacle, just raw promises whispered between two people who believed in what they had found. Daxton had written his own vows. Alina's were handwritten in a small notebook, filled with notes she'd kept since the beginning. At the reception, instead of a first dance, they sat beside each other on a wooden bench under a canopy of string. Lights, holding hands as her sister played a cello arrangement of a song they'd both loved in college. There was a gentleness to that day that never needed explanation. For a time, everything they touched turned warm. Their apartment in Manhattan wasn't just beautiful, it felt lived in. He filled the kitchen with flowers. She covered the walls in art, by students from underfunded schools. They had their routines, their shared playlists, their Sunday grocery lists with inside jokes written beside ingredients. Tell me this, have you ever given up something for love? A job, a dream, a city, a part of yourself? Share your story in the comments. There's strength in saying it out loud. 6 months into their marriage, Alina made a decision that surprised even her closest friends. She walked away from a lucrative offer at a top design firm, not because she wasn't qualified, not because she lacked ambition, but because she wanted to build something of her own, something that mattered beyond billable hours and brand redesigns. She had a vision, a foundation dedicated to helping underserved youth gain access to the world of design and technology, not just by giving out laptops or throwing weekend workshops, but by mentoring, by making space, by showing kids that design was a language they could speak too. Most people told her it was risky, that she was stepping away from security. Daxton didn't. He looked at her one evening, after she'd laid out the rough sketch of her idea on a napkin between them, and simply said, "Let's build it." And so they did. He used his connections to bring attention to the foundation. He made generous contributions, introduced her to potential partners, and offered his name when doors wouldn't open otherwise. But the vision, the direction, the soul of it, that was all Alina. She didn't want it to be a vanity project. She didn't want her name on everything. What mattered was the work. She spent her mornings with kids from boroughs forgotten by tech companies. She stayed up late reviewing applications, sending feedback, writing letters of recommendation for teenagers with stories most people never cared to hear. Daxton would bring her dinner when she forgot to eat. He'd sit with her, scrolling through his phone but staying close. Sometimes she'd fall asleep on the couch with student portfolios strewn across her lap. He'd carry her to bed, tuck a blanket around her and whisper, "You make everything better." For a while, that sentence became her anchor. Together, they became a quiet force in the philanthropy space. Tech blogs wrote about them, calling them the future of ethical innovation. Investors admired the balance they seemed to have. Alina was the soul, Daxton the strategy. They showed up to galas in simple elegance, hand in hand, never flaunting, never loud, just present. Behind closed doors, they had their rhythms. He would take late-night calls in the study while she prepped curriculum outlines. They took spontaneous weekend drives just to get out of the city. They argued about dishes, about scheduling, about whether or not a project was worth it. But even their disagreements had softness at the edges. They were different people, but they respected the same values. On their second anniversary, Daxton surprised her with a library installation in one of the foundation's learning centers, rows of bookshelves, each filled with design resources, biographies, and classic literature. In the center, a chair and lamp for reading. She cried, not because of the gesture alone, but because he remembered a story she once told him about how her mother taught her to read sitting on the floor beside a single lamp. Moments like that made her believe in what they had. Still, in hindsight, the first fractures were subtle. Daxton started traveling more. A new expansion deal pulled him deeper into global contracts. Late nights stretched into red-eye flights. Calls from Asia at 3 a.m. became the norm. He said he was building something for both of them, something big. Alina supported him. She understood the demands of leadership. She covered for his absence at events. She told staff, "He's just under pressure. It'll calm down soon." But sometimes, when she caught him staring into space after a meeting, his eyes looked far away. Not distracted, removed, like he was somewhere she couldn't follow. He still held her. He still said the right things. But even warmth can feel cold when it's repeated without presence. What they had was still beautiful. But something was shifting. One morning, Alina walked into the kitchen to find him staring out the window, coffee untouched. She kissed his shoulder. He smiled, but it was brief. "You okay?" she asked. "Just tired," he said. She didn't push. She made breakfast instead. And they carried on. They were still seen as a team. But inside, she was beginning to feel like she was cheering alone. Still, she held on. She held on because love, to her, wasn't about convenience. It was about showing up even when it got hard. She believed in the man who once read her Neruda in the dark, who once stood in a room, full of skeptics, and said, "She doesn't need me, but I'm better because of her." But belief, no matter how deep, can't keep something alive when the other person has already stepped away, quietly, without telling you. It started with the silence, not the comfortable kind they used to share while reading or cooking together, but the kind that lingered just long enough to feel like absence. The kind where a question floated in the air a little too long before being answered, where eye contact felt like a negotiation. At first, Alina told herself it was stress. Virion Tech was expanding faster than projected. New investors, international meetings, intense media scrutiny. She saw how exhausted Daxton looked after each flight, how he barely touched his food, how the dark circles under his eyes deepened. She didn't press him. She gave him space. That's what love does, she thought. But space can be a doorway, and someone had walked through it. He stopped coming to her events. There was always a reason. Meetings running late, last-minute calls, emergencies at HQ. She tried not to take it personally. She would smile, text him updates, send photos. He'd reply with emojis. Sometimes a short, polite looks great, but that was it. Polite, not present. She began to notice the small things. His laughter became less frequent, their conversations shorter. When she reached for his hand during a dinner with friends, his fingers felt stiff, like the gesture surprised him. She excused it, told herself it was a phase, that all relationships had seasons. But every night she curled up on her side of the bed and stared at the ceiling. A quiet thought gnawed at her. He's drifting. He no longer asked about her students. He used to remember their names: Malik, Juno, Destiny. He'd ask how their projects were going, if she needed help reviewing portfolios. Now, when she brought them up, he'd nod vaguely and change the subject. Or worse, not respond at all. He became protective of his phone. It was always face down, always on silent. He started taking calls in the hallway. His laptop, once left open without thought, now required a password, even from her. Alina never considered herself suspicious by nature. She wasn't the type to snoop, to second guess. But one night, while folding laundry in the bedroom, she heard a notification ping on his tablet. He wasn't home. Her hand hovered over the screen. She didn't open it, because even then, a part of her didn't want to see the truth. Not because she feared it, but because she wasn't ready for what it might mean. Their penthouse began to feel like a waiting room. She'd cook dinner, and it would sit untouched. He'd say he'd be home by 9 and walk in at midnight, smelling faintly of a cologne she didn't recognize. He brushed past her kisses with distracted smiles. One morning, as she stood in the kitchen making coffee, Daxton walked in, barely said hello, grabbed a protein bar, and left. No eye contact, no kiss, no warmth, just movement. She leaned against the counter after the door shut, holding her coffee, staring into nothing. That ache, the kind that builds quietly, like water leaking through the ceiling, finally became impossible to ignore. She didn't want to accuse him. She didn't want to plead. She just wanted her partner back. That night, she sat at the dining table, waiting. The lights were low. His plate sat across from hers. A candle flickered between them. Time passed. It was 9:30 p.m. when the elevator finally opened. He walked in, surprised to see her awake. "Didn't expect you to wait up," he said, loosening his tie. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at him. Really looked at him. His eyes didn't meet hers. "Daxton, is there someone else?" He froze. Not because of the question, but because of the timing. Because she finally asked. If you've ever sensed the truth before it was spoken. If you've ever felt love slip through your fingers without a sound, share this story. Someone else may need to hear that they're not alone. He didn't answer right away. He walked past her, took off his jacket, and placed it over the back of a chair. The silence between them was thick, more than discomfort. It was acknowledgement. "Alina." His voice was calm, careful, almost rehearsed. "It's not that simple." She blinked. Once, "Not that simple." It was the kind of phrase people use when they want to soften their wrongdoing, as if murky words might blur the truth enough to excuse it. "How long?" she asked, her voice steady, even as her hands gripped the edge of the table. "Almost a year." he replied, barely above a whisper. A year. While she was building classrooms. While she was speaking at youth summits. While she was folding his shirts and leaving handwritten notes in his luggage. A year. She didn't scream, didn't cry. Her body remained still, but everything inside her broke like glass under pressure. Who is she? She asked, though she already knew. Her name is Lena, he said. She works with us. Executive assistant. Of course. Young, eager, always nearby. Alina had met her once, briefly at a corporate dinner. She remembered her. Wide smile, sharp cheekbones, too many apologies when passing drinks. Alina felt no anger toward the woman. All of it was reserved for the man who had once promised her forever. Daxton sat down across from her, as if proximity could soften the cruelty of what he'd done. I didn't mean for it to happen, he said. I was tired. I was under pressure. She listened. She was just there. So was I, Alina whispered. I was always there. His eyes fell to the table. She stared at the candle burning between them. Its flame flickered, struggling against the still air, casting a small, trembling shadow. Do you love her? She asked. I don't know. The answer landed like a punch, not because he did, but because he didn't even know if he cared enough to choose. In that moment, something inside her shifted. She realized she couldn't fight for someone who had already walked away in every way that mattered. She thought about the students she mentored, about the way she always told them that their worth didn't come from validation, that love should never require shrinking. Yet here she was, sitting across from a man who had hollowed her out, slowly, and called it complexity. I'm leaving, she said quietly. Daxton looked up. Alina, don't do this. We can talk. No, she said, standing. We already didn't. She packed a suitcase that night. Just one. She didn't take jewelry, didn't take framed photos, or the anniversary gift he'd given her the year before. Only essentials, and her dignity. As she moved through the bedroom, the air felt heavy, like the walls were grieving with her. She paused only once, in front of their shared bookshelf. Her eyes landed on a poetry volume they used to read together. She left it behind. He watched from the doorway as she zipped up the suitcase. I didn't want it to end this way, he murmured. It ended the moment you stopped choosing me, she replied. No shouting, no grand farewell, just finality. She walked out of the penthouse without looking back. No media frenzy, no press release, no explanation posted online, only silence, and a door that closed behind her. The night was still. The city moved beneath her like it always had. But for Alina, time had split in two, before the question and after the answer. She found a cab, gave an address, and sat in the back seat with her hand over her chest. Not because it was hurting, but because something inside had gone completely quiet. The apartment she found was modest, a one-bedroom walk-up in Brooklyn, nothing like the glass and marble life she'd left behind. There were no rooftop views, no concierge, no imported furniture, just a small kitchen with mismatched cabinets and a window that let in golden light during the late afternoons. The first night, she sat on the floor with takeout noodles and a single fork. No music, no TV, just the sound of her own breath. She thought it would hurt more, but sometimes, when pain is stretched over so many days, it loses its sharpness. It becomes something quieter, not numbness, not acceptance, just stillness. In the days that followed, she kept her head down. She answered emails. She tried to keep her foundation's work moving, but things began to shift. Noticeably, one donor canceled a recurring pledge without warning. Then another. Partnerships she'd spent months cultivating suddenly backed out, citing reallocations and budget constraints. She wasn't naive. She knew what it was. They hadn't supported her. They'd supported his name attached to her dream. She thought the foundation could stand on its own. But some people only offer hands when the spotlight is on. She tried calling a few colleagues from the industry, people who once sent her invites to every launch, every summit. Voicemails, delayed replies, polite dismissals wrapped in careful phrasing. Only one friend came to see her, a former design student turned creative director, who brought groceries and stayed for tea. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The visit said everything. It was enough. Meanwhile, headlines began to appear, not about her, but about him. Photos of Daxton and Lena stepping out of a restaurant, speculation in glossy columns, editorials about CEO passion versus professionalism. Alina ignored it all. She wasn't interested in scandals. She wasn't waiting for karma. She was rebuilding, quietly, without an audience. She began walking every morning, just a few blocks, to clear her mind, to remind herself that life was still moving. At the community center near her apartment, she saw a flyer for a youth digital art workshop. The instructor had canceled last minute. They were looking for volunteers. She tore off the tab with the number and took it home. She didn't call right away, but 2 days later, she showed up. "I have some experience," she said softly, "with design. And with students." The director didn't recognize her name. That felt like a blessing. Her first class was small, 5 kids. Outdated laptop. Projector. No expectations. She sat on the floor with them, asked questions, let them lead. She didn't lecture. She listened. One of the students, a quiet teen named Malik, stayed after class to show her his notebook filled with sketches of phone screens and app layouts. "They're not that good," he mumbled. "They're thoughtful," she replied, "and that matters more than perfection." Weeks passed. Then, months. The classes filled. Word spread. Kids brought friends. Parents started showing up early just to thank her. She didn't advertise the work. She didn't post for attention. But slowly, the foundation began to breathe again. Not because of big checks or celebrity names, but because the heart returned to it. Her heart. Every now and then, Daxton would send an email. Short. Apologetic. Vague. She never replied. What could she say? That she forgave him? That she didn't? She had nothing left to prove. The pain hadn't vanished, but it no longer held her by the throat. And with each day that passed, the space Daxton once occupied in her heart felt less like a wound and more like a closed chapter. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. Alina stood still, arms wrapped around the handle of her suitcase, her fingers trembling, not from fear, but from everything her body had held in for too long. She had rehearsed this moment once in her head, back when her instincts had whispered warnings. But reality didn't come with neat lines or a feeling of triumph. There was no victory in leaving. Only clarity. The streets outside were quiet, a city so alive, yet completely unaware of what had just ended. She stepped into the back of a cab and gave the address of a friend who kept a key beneath her mat. The driver asked no questions. She appreciated that. Inside the apartment, she didn't cry. She didn't fall apart. She sat on the couch and stared at the wall until dawn. What played in her mind wasn't the moment he said her name, or the way he admitted to everything. It wasn't the words. It was the months before, the ones where she begged herself to ignore what she already knew. Because she wanted to believe the man she loved wouldn't become careless with her heart. Because she thought history had meant more than novelty. The truth of it burned more than the betrayal itself. Lena was in her late 20s, bright, eager, and available. Everything about her presence felt like a movie script, predictable and pitiful. Alina didn't blame her, not really. She blamed Daxton for choosing the shortcut of flattery over the endurance of commitment. It wasn't just the infidelity that cut deep. It was the ease with which he'd shifted gears, the comfort in which he had lied, the way he'd let her carry the emotional weight for so long while he retreated into someone else's arms. A week later, her foundation's board met without her. One of the members, a longtime donor, had quietly suggested a restructuring. They said it would help stabilize relationships with corporate sponsors. It was coded language, clean and polished. It meant, "You're no longer the one they trust to lead this." Daxton hadn't publicly denounced her. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. And in the world they'd once navigated together, silence from the powerful echoed louder than any accusation. She resigned, not because she lacked strength, but because strength sometimes means choosing peace over proximity to what's poisoned. Her belongings were moved in boxes by a small service she hired online. She gave them access to the storage unit. She didn't want to re-enter the penthouse, not even to collect memories. She told them to leave behind the wedding album. Let him keep it. Let him sit with what they had and watch it gather dust. Alina's phone remained quiet. A few messages from close friends. A check-in from her sister. Nothing from Daxton. Not even a final apology. She realized he wouldn't reach out, not out of guilt, but out of cowardice. Because facing her would mean facing the version of himself he'd tried to bury. Nights were hardest. She would lie in bed, fully awake, replaying moments from years past. The first time he said, "I love you," the look on his face when they signed the lease on their home. The morning he brought her coffee in bed, humming quietly to himself. None of those moments were lies, but he had left them behind as if they meant nothing, and that's what haunted her. Not that he cheated, but that he walked away from something real, for something that never had roots. She began writing again. Not publicly, just for herself. Small reflections, one paragraph at a time. I don't miss who he was. I miss who I was before I loved someone who didn't know how to stay. Alina didn't seek revenge. She didn't post cryptic messages, didn't return the favor. Instead, she slipped quietly out of the spotlight they once shared. She understood something now, something most people only realize after heartbreak. You can lose a person without losing yourself, but only if you're willing to walk away before you disappear completely. There's a particular kind of grief that doesn't make noise. It doesn't scream in pillowcases or show up with mascara streaks on bathroom tiles. It doesn't beg or bargain. It just settles deep, quiet, and steady, like something packed away in the corners of your ribs. That was the kind of grief Alina carried now. It didn't ask for pity. It asked for space. She stopped wearing her wedding band the morning she realized she hadn't looked for it in days. It had been in a dish by the sink, forgotten, just another object. There was no ceremonial removal, no dramatic tossing, just indifference. And in some ways, that scared her more than the heartbreak, because apathy doesn't come easily to those who love with intention. When she walked past magazine stands that featured Daxton's latest product launches, she didn't stop. His face, once familiar, had become a brand, a name attached to things that no longer belonged to her world. What they shared had been real once, but she no longer craved proof. Some truths don't need witnesses to remain valid. One afternoon, she opened her inbox to find an invitation, automated, sent to a mailing list she'd forgotten she was on. It was for a conference, design, innovation, the kind of space where she used to shine. She closed the email, not because she didn't want to be there, but because she realized she hadn't even thought about returning to that world until now. Her days had become filled with smaller moments, teaching, organizing handouts, encouraging a student who felt too behind to belong. There was no applause, no press, but it felt honest. It felt hers. In the quiet of her new apartment, she often found herself walking barefoot, from room to room, not doing anything, just moving, listening. There was something healing in the rhythm of solitude. No curated silence, no tension wrapped in polite conversation, just space. She stopped trying to explain the loss, not because it didn't matter, but because the need to justify it had disappeared. She didn't owe anyone a breakdown. She didn't owe Daxton closure he hadn't earned. There were days when memories knocked anyway, the sound of footsteps in the hallway that made her heart jump, before her mind reminded her she was alone, the scent of citrus and bergamot on a stranger's jacket that sent her spiraling into 3 years ago, the way she still instinctively reached for 2 mugs when making tea. But healing doesn't happen in clean lines. It's messy, illogical, inconvenient. Some mornings she woke up with her chest light. Other mornings, she sat in the shower longer than she needed to. Both were valid. She never told the full story to anyone. People asked in subtle ways. Friends hinted. Journalists speculated. But she let them wonder. Because pain, when kept sacred, becomes a form of power. Not to wield against others, but to ground yourself in what you've survived. In late spring, she opened the last box from storage. Inside, she found a photograph from their first trip to Florence. They were laughing, arms around each other, shadows on stone walls, joy so visible it hurt to look at. She placed the photo in a drawer. Not out of spite, but because some memories don't need to be destroyed. Just shelved. She no longer thought of Daxton daily. When she did, it was without yearning. There was no longer a version of him she was waiting to return. And more importantly, there was no longer a version of herself she was trying to go back to. That woman was gone, but the one rising in her place, she was stronger. Not bitter, not hardened, just clear. Letting go isn't always about moving on. Sometimes it's about standing still long enough to feel the weight, and deciding to put it down anyway. The mornings in Brooklyn began slowly. No curated schedule, no obligations tethered to someone else's expectations. Just quiet sunbeams through thin curtains, the sound of buses outside, and the occasional clatter from the bakery downstairs. Alina had no office now, no staff meetings, no calendar full of appearances and media calls. Her foundation, once a rising name in tech equity, was now a skeleton of what it had been. The board had reshaped it, rebranded it, removed her name from nearly every initiative. There was no press release about it, just edits, one by one, until she was erased from the very thing she had built. People asked where she went. They speculated. A few online forums buzzed for a few days, but with time, the story dissolved. That's what happens when you no longer serve someone else's narrative. But she didn't chase relevance. She chased meaning. A few blocks from her apartment was the Kingsbridge Community Youth Center, underfunded, understaffed, but stubbornly open. She passed it every day on her morning walks, always pausing at the wall. Of flyers outside, dance workshops, literacy tutoring, free lunch days. One morning, a new sign went up, Intro to Design, volunteer instructors needed. She stared at it for a long time, not because she doubted her skill, but because she hadn't stood in front of a classroom since everything fell apart. Would she still know how to lead? Would her voice still carry? 3 days later, she walked through the door and asked to speak with the director. The classroom had no tech setup, just a whiteboard, some mismatched desks, and a cabinet full of loose cords and outdated tablets. But the kids who showed up? They were alive with ideas, curious, skeptical, restless, but hungry to create. That first day, she taught them how to build wireframes using markers and construction paper. She used tape and string to simulate user flow. The students laughed when the makeshift designs fell apart mid-presentation. She laughed with them, and for the first time in months, she felt something loosen in her chest. Not pride. Peace. Her classes grew, from 5 students to 9, then 12, then a waiting list. Word spread through local neighborhoods. Parents came by just to thank her. Kids stayed after class asking for feedback, sketchbooks clutched to their chests. She didn't tell them about the life she'd lived before. She never brought up Daxton, never mentioned her foundation, because here, none of that mattered. Here, she was just Miss Alina, and somehow that felt more powerful than anything she'd been called before. If you believe in the quiet strength of starting over, if you know what it means, to rebuild not out of revenge, but out of purpose, hit that subscribe button. This channel brings stories that remind us your lowest point is not your ending. It's where your real story begins. Malik was the kind of student who rarely spoke unless spoken to. 15, quiet, observant, and always sitting closest to the exit. His notebooks were full of drawings, none of them shared. He never raised his hand, but he never missed a class. Alina noticed him from the beginning, not just because of his silence, but because of how intently he watched. His eyes never drifted. He studied everything, the way she held the marker, how she explained, interface balance, where she placed her hand when tracing app flow. One afternoon, she asked to see what he was working on. He hesitated. "It's not done," he said. "That's okay," she replied. "Done isn't always the goal. Honest is." He opened his notebook slowly. What she saw stunned her. Meticulously detailed sketches, thoughtful ideas. A mobile app designed to help nonverbal children communicate using icon-based navigation and voice assistance. Who's it for? she asked gently. My sister, he replied. She doesn't talk. Alina closed the notebook and looked at him, not as a teacher, but as someone who understood what it meant to care so deeply about helping someone that you taught yourself how to build the solution. Do you want help making it real? He didn't answer right away. He just nodded. Over the next 4 months, they met twice a week after class. Alina guided him through the process of turning sketches into working prototypes. She used her old network, quietly, carefully, to connect him with a nonprofit that specialized in accessible tech. She never put her name on the proposal, never asked for credit. When the app was presented to the NGO board, Malik stood there with a nervous smile, stumbling over his words, but speaking anyway. The panel listened, asked questions, took notes. 2 weeks later, he received a full scholarship to a pre-college tech program and a grant to continue developing the app. Malik's story made its way into a local newsletter. A journalist wanted to interview his mentor. He told them it was just someone at the community center. No last name. No spotlight. Alina smiled when she read it. That was enough. She didn't need headlines. She had impact. Her inbox slowly began to fill again, but this time, not with meeting invites or investor requests. These were messages from parents, from teens, from educators who heard about what she was doing, not from media, from people. One evening, Malik handed her a thank you card. It was hand-drawn, with a rough sketch of the app's home screen on the cover. Inside, just 5 words. You saw me. Thank you. She kept that card in the front pocket of her worn leather bag, not because it reminded her of what she'd done, but because it reminded her of who she'd become. The woman who once stood beside a billionaire was now leading after-school sessions, in a borrowed classroom with a chalk-streaked board and a second-hand coffee maker. And yet, she was fuller than she'd been in years. Her days had rhythm now, simple ones. Wake early, prep lesson plans, make tea, teach, encourage, rest. She walked to the corner store, exchanged small talk with the florist on Tuesdays, and brought extra pencils to class in case someone forgot theirs. The kind of life no one writes headlines about, the kind that matters anyway. She no longer measured her value by her association to someone else's spotlight. Her identity had detached itself from the old narrative. She wasn't rebuilding to prove anything to the world, only to honor herself. One Thursday evening, the community center director pulled her aside. You've changed the energy around here, she said. Alina smiled, brushing chalk dust from her sleeve. I'm just doing what I know how to do. No. You're giving them something no one else is. You show up. That line stayed with her. Not because it praised her work, but because it reminded her of everything she hadn't received in return. Back when she gave so much of herself without boundaries, she thought of Daxton less often now, not because the pain had vanished, but because it no longer had room to grow. When his name appeared in headlines again, this time regarding leadership shakeups and internal investigations, she skimmed past it. There was no satisfaction, no smugness, just neutrality. She didn't wish him harm. She just no longer wished him back. She ran into one of their old acquaintances at a bookstore, a woman who used to host charity galas and always spoke a little too loudly. I've been meaning to reach out, she said, visibly awkward. Everything that happened. I'm so sorry. Alina simply nodded. You look well. I am, she replied. It wasn't said to convince anyone. It was said because it was true. The day she fully understood her healing had arrived without warning. She was walking home after a long class, groceries in one hand, a folder of student projects in the other. The wind caught her coat, and a loose paper flew down the sidewalk. She chased it, laughing, until it landed near a little girl holding her mother's hand. The child picked it up and handed it to her. You dropped this, she said with a grin. Alina thanked her. As they walked away, she overheard the mother whisper, That's Miss Alina. She teaches the tech class. She helps the kids. That moment, so small, landed with surprising weight. She had been known for being someone's wife, then forgotten altogether. Now, she was remembered for her own work, her own kindness, her own consistency. She returned home that night, lit a candle, and made tea. She opened her notebook and wrote just one sentence. I didn't need to fight to be seen. I just needed to stop giving my light to someone who refused to reflect it. She had lost everything that once defined her. And she had discovered more than she ever thought possible, not by chasing approval, not by holding on, but by letting go and showing up. The press turned slowly, not all at once, and not with a bang, just subtle shifts in tone. Articles once full of admiration began to feel more cautious. Journalists who used to call Daxton visionary now used words like calculated. Analysts questioned if his leadership was scaling too fast, too recklessly. What began as whispers became headlines. A rushed product launch failed to meet safety standards. Stocks dipped. Then came the internal emails leaked to a blog, a few lines suggesting misuse of discretionary funds, vague promises made to investors, inflated projections behind closed doors. It wasn't criminal, but it was enough to plant doubt. The board called an emergency meeting, not to accuse, but to assess. There were questions about accountability, about decision-making without transparency, about the appearance of bias in promotions. Lena's name was mentioned, not directly, just often enough to become uncomfortable. And suddenly, the woman he'd once clung to for emotional escape became a liability in professional rooms. The relationship, built in secrecy and adrenaline, didn't last long under the glare of reality. What had once felt thrilling now felt fragile. She wasn't built for pressure. He wasn't built for vulnerability. They stopped going out together, stopped posting filtered photos from luxury suites. Within months, they unfollowed each other on every platform. The breakup wasn't announced. It just happened. Like most things that lose purpose once exposed, Daxton still showed up in interviews, his tone polished, his suits tailored. But there was a tightness around his mouth now. The charm didn't land the same. The pauses were longer. He blinked more. Virion's next funding round fell short of projections. 2 board members resigned. One of the company's founding engineers left without explanation. He told himself it was normal. It wasn't. He tried reaching out to old allies. Some responded, cordial but distant. Others didn't reply at all. He called one of the media consultants Alina used to work with during her foundation days. "We're not taking new clients," they said flatly. He hung up, staring at his screen. There was a time when people would have rearranged their week just to get 15 minutes with him. That time had passed. The final blow didn't come from a scandal. It came from stillness. Investors stopped calling. Event invites stopped arriving. Panels where he was once the keynote now moved forward without asking. One by one, the rooms that used to light up at his arrival began to dim. His name no longer sparked excitement. It stirred caution. When Virion's lead backer pulled out of their next round, the board scheduled a private session without him. A week later, an official statement was released. Daxton Reeve would be stepping down from daily operations to focus on strategic vision. Polished words, internally agreed upon. But everyone understood what it meant. He stayed in the penthouse, pacing rooms that once held laughter and warmth. The walls echoed with silence now, bare shelves, untouched wine bottles. The faint scent of stale cologne on suits he no longer wore. He scrolled through old photos, conferences, interviews, gala nights. But the ones that held his eyes the longest weren't taken by professionals. They were of Alina, snapped candidly, smiling beside a mural at a community center, teaching kids how to sketch on paper napkins, kneeling to tie the shoelaces of a student too shy to ask. She hadn't just been kind, she had been real. And he hadn't just lost her, he'd discarded her. For what? For thrill, for control, for validation he should have earned from within, not stolen from admiration. He opened a tab in his browser and typed her name. No official website, no profile press, but a local news feature popped up, a piece about a young Brooklyn student building an accessibility app. His mentor mentioned only by first name. There was a photo. It was blurry, low resolution, but unmistakably her. She was smiling, not posing, smiling. In a world where people chase recognition, she had found something steadier. He once believed power came from being seen by everyone. She had learned it came from showing up for someone. and she hadn't needed him to do it. He drafted a message to her, just a simple line. You were always the best part. But he never sent it. Some things once broken stay that way, not out of bitterness, but because healing means knowing what not to reopen. She never reached out, never commented, never corrected the rumors, or sought to reclaim credit. Her absence in his life now rang louder than any confrontation could have, and in that silence, he finally heard the truth. He had not just lost a woman. He had lost the mirror that showed him who he could have been, if he'd chosen right. The invitation came as a surprise. A global summit on design and ethics, hosted in Geneva, sponsored by a coalition of education leaders and tech innovators. The kind of event that shaped policy, not just headlines. Her name had been nominated anonymously, then unanimously approved. Alina read the email twice. She hadn't attended anything this public in years. She wasn't sure she wanted to. But the theme of the keynote track stopped her, designing with humanity in mind. She thought of Malik, of the kids still emailing her their latest mock-ups, of the parents who showed up early, waiting just to say thank you, of the card in her bag that still read, "You saw me." She accepted. She arrived quietly. No entourage, no press announcements, just a black carry-on, her notes folded into a slim leather folio, and the same calm that had carried her through every lesson she'd taught since Brooklyn. The conference venue was a converted opera house, arched ceilings, golden trim, velvet seating. The night before her speech, she walked through the hall, letting the empty chairs breathe around her. She touched the edge of the stage. It didn't feel intimidating. It felt earned. The day of her keynote arrived. Backstage, the event coordinator handed her a mic and smiled. "They're excited for you." She nodded. Her heart didn't race. It pulsed gently, like it knew it belonged here. She peeked through the side curtain to glance at the audience. And there he was. Front row, still. Older, eyes fixed on the stage. Daxton, she inhaled, not sharply, just once. No panic, no bitterness, just breath. When they called her name, the applause filled the room. Not wild, not theatrical, but grounded. Like the audience already knew they were about to receive something that mattered. She walked slowly to the podium, placed her notes in front of her, and looked up. The light was bright, but she didn't flinch. Good design, she began, isn't just about solving problems. It's about noticing them in the first place. A pause. In my early years, I thought designing with empathy meant anticipating a user's needs. I've learned since then, it means listening before anything else is built. It means recognizing that dignity is not a feature. It's a foundation. The room was still, not stiff, engaged. She continued, "I stand here today not because I took the expected path or held on to institutional power. I'm here because I lost nearly everything, except the part of me that refused to stop showing up. What we build means nothing if it only serves the privileged few. If we want to lead with ethics, we must start with the overlooked, and if we claim to care about innovation, we must invest in those who have never been invited to the table, not just those born sitting at it." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform. She just told the truth. About failure, about letting go, about rediscovering worth outside of recognition, and about what it means to start over, not because you want to, but because staying would have meant disappearing. In the front row, Daxton sat perfectly still. He didn't look away once. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't need to. This was no longer about him. It never really was. The applause came slowly, then rose to a full room of standing admiration. Not because she delivered a speech full of theatrics, but because truth always lands heavier when it's spoken without apology. Alina stepped back from the podium, nodded once, and walked off stage. Backstage, she exhaled. Not relief, not nerves, just release. What she had carried for so long was now shared, but not in fragments of pain. It was shared as purpose. She unclipped her mic and walked toward the lounge area, still holding her notes. That's where she saw him, Daxton, standing by himself near the tall windows, hands in his pockets, eyes on her. The room buzzed with small talk, but around them, it felt quiet again. He took a step forward. You were brilliant. His voice was softer than she remembered. Not unsure, but smaller, worn down in a way that couldn't be hidden behind confidence anymore. She nodded politely. Thank you. He paused, like he wanted to say more, but hadn't rehearsed it this time. You look, well, he said. She gave a half smile. It didn't reach her eyes. I am. Another pause. Then he said it. I miss us. Not dramatic, not pleading, just a statement. Honest, empty. Alina didn't flinch. You miss who I was when I made you feel whole, she said quietly. But I'm not her anymore. I don't need to complete anyone. His face shifted slightly, like he wanted to argue but couldn't. Because she was right. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, ready to leave. Alina, he said behind her, voice a little hoarse. Are you happy? She turned, not with anger, not even sadness, just clarity, more than I ever was with you. She walked away. No dramatic music, no final look over her shoulder, just a steady exit, one foot in front of the other. She didn't need his regret. She didn't even need his understanding. She had already given herself everything she once begged from him. Peace, purpose, wholeness. That night, as she sat in her hotel room overlooking the city skyline, she opened her laptop and saw new emails from teachers and students back home. Questions, updates, sketches attached to shaky camera phone pictures. This was her world now, not built in the shadow of someone else's name, but built slowly, kindly, and fully, in her own. The air in Lisbon was different, warm, not just in temperature, but in texture. It carried the scent of sea salt and grilled citrus, of late mornings and soft jazz from open windows. Life moved slower here, and for the first time, Alina matched its pace. Her home was a sunlit flat on a quiet street. White walls, open windows, bookshelves filled with well-worn poetry, and children's picture books stacked in the corners. The kitchen always smelled like steeped tea or bread fresh from the market. In the early mornings, before the city stretched awake, she sat on the terrace with her coffee, a journal in hand, and the soft laughter of her daughter humming behind the glass door. Her name was Aya, 5 years old, wild curls, curiosity that never paused. She had her mother's eyes and her own voice, loud and free. Aya didn't know about Manhattan skyscrapers or foundation fundraisers. She didn't know about cold kitchens or fading smiles. She just knew that her mother was here, fully here. Elian entered her life like a poem, not meant to impress, just meant to stay. A writer by trade, quiet by nature, Elian never asked Alina to explain where she had been or what had broken her. He never tried to fix her either. He simply listened, and when she didn't want to speak, he stayed beside her, holding her hand like a quiet promise. Their love didn't come with declarations. It came with breakfast waiting on slow Sundays, with shoes placed beside hers at the door, with folded laundry, handwritten notes tucked inside her planner, and a gentle, knowing silence when she stood staring out the window a little too long. Elian loved her without needing to be the center of her healing, and in doing so, he became part of it. Aya adored him. She climbed into his lap while he edited essays, smeared jam on his manuscripts, and called him by his first name with full confidence. They made up stories together, Aya dictating, Elian typing. Alina would return from errands to find them mid-adventure, dragons running lemonade stands, owls driving taxis, invisible creatures helping lost travelers find their way home. One evening, as Aya fell asleep between them, her tiny hand draped over Alina's wrist, Elian whispered, "You built something beautiful." Alina smiled. "I didn't build it alone." He shook his head gently. "No, but you carried the blueprint." Alina no longer woke up with the urge to prove anything. There were no timelines, no goals built around appearances. She wrote when she felt like it, sometimes in long stretches, sometimes not at all. Her work now wasn't about branding, it was about depth. Sometimes she mentored students through email. Other times, she spent an entire afternoon showing Aya how to fold paper cranes. She'd once measured her value through output. Now she measured it by presence, by how gently she responded to the world, by how often she laughed, by how little she needed to be understood to feel complete. Lisbon's pace suited her spirit. Afternoons were for long walks along the coast, Aya skipping beside her, pointing at street musicians and mimicking their rhythms. Evenings were for dinners at home, their small table cluttered with cutlery and laughter. Some nights Alina and Elian would read on the sofa in quiet companionship. No music, no words, just comfort. And yet, the absence of noise never felt empty. It felt earned. She hadn't forgotten what she'd endured. She remembered the loneliness of being left, the grief that arrived quietly, the weight of rebuilding without anyone clapping for it. But what had once been scars had softened into reminders of strength, of clarity, of everything she learned about who she would never be again. She kept a folder of old letters she'd never sent, messages she wrote to Daxton in her loneliest moments, unsent drafts filled with questions and pieces of herself she had wanted to reclaim. She burned them on a quiet morning in April, not out of anger, but because she no longer needed anything from the woman who had written them. That version of herself was brave, but she was no longer the one leading. She'd evolved. She'd grown roots. On Aya's 6th birthday, they celebrated with chocolate cake, sidewalk, chalk, and music that played too loud through Elian's tiny speaker. Neighbors dropped in. Children danced barefoot in the courtyard. Alina leaned against the wall and watched. She didn't think about the past. She didn't think about what could have been. She just watched her daughter laugh in the sun and knew, deep in her bones, that this was the prize. Her story didn't end with revenge, or recognition, or redemption from the one who left. It ended with freedom. Freedom to choose softness over performance. Freedom to love without fear. Freedom to be seen, even when no one was watching. What does real strength look like to you? Is it walking away? Starting over? Raising a child on your own terms? Saying no when it would be easier to stay silent? Drop it in the comments. Someone may need to see your answer more than you know. And if you believe in stories that honor quiet power and soft rebirth, subscribe. There's more ahead. So much more. Not every story ends with the person who hurt you finally understanding what they lost. Sometimes the real ending is you, understanding what you deserve. Alina Moreau's journey wasn't about rebuilding a public image. It was about reclaiming something far more sacred, herself. And what she discovered along the way wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud, but it was unshakable. Here are the truths her life now stands on. Anyone can be betrayed, but not everyone chooses to respond with grace, to choose healing over hate, to rebuild instead of retaliate. When Alina walked away from the man who broke her, she didn't fight to expose him. She didn't run toward chaos. She simply stood in the truth. And sometimes, that's the most powerful thing you can do. In a world addicted to scandal and spectacle, dignity often looks like silence. It's choosing not to clap back, not to compete, not to explain yourself to people who only show up when you're winning. Alina didn't win because she made Daxton fall. She won because she refused to fall with him. People talk about fresh starts like they're shameful, but it takes extraordinary strength to release a life you once dreamed of. When that dream no longer fits the truth, Alina chose a quieter life in a smaller space. She gave up the platform, the status, the comfort. And what did she find? A daughter, a partner, a new version of herself that didn't ask for permission to be full. Too many people give away their value just to be chosen. They shrink, they compromise, they stay silent. But Alina learned the difference between being loved and being used to fill someone else's void. She stopped offering proof of her worth, and in doing so, she became untouchable. You should not have to chase someone to be kept. You should not have to carry a relationship on your back, hoping that one day they'll notice. The love Alina found in the end wasn't loud. It didn't sweep her off her feet. It simply stood beside her, holding space, asking nothing but presence. And that is what staying looks like. No one threw a parade when Alina started over. She wasn't trending. She wasn't celebrated. But in the quiet corners of her new life, real impact bloomed. Through a boy named Malik, through through the kids who now see themselves in places they never imagined, through a smile passed between a woman and her daughter on a Lisbon street. This is the kind of legacy that never fades. So if you're watching this, maybe you've been left. Maybe you're rebuilding. Maybe you're learning how to breathe again after being someone else's afterthought. Let this remind you, you don't need their apology to find your peace. You don't need their approval to matter again. Your story is still being written, and your becoming is already in motion. If this story touched something in you, share it. There's someone out there who needs to know that healing is possible, that starting over is not shameful, that softness is still strength. And if you're new here, or if you've been walking with us for a while, subscribe, because this channel isn't just about stories. It's about truth. It's about power reclaimed. It's about you.